There's a specific sound a door makes when it opens onto something you were never supposed to see. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft click, a small mechanical release, and then the world rearranges itself permanently around what your eyes take in during the next 3 seconds. My name is Nate. I'm 34 years old, I work in urban planning for the city, and on a Saturday evening in October I pushed open a bedroom door at a party in a house I had been to dozens of times. In a room I had sat in and laughed in and stayed too late in more times than I could count, because my best friend Ryan had invited me there, and I was looking for my wife. I found her. I need you to understand what Ryan was to me before I tell you what he did, because without that context the story becomes something smaller and more ordinary than it actually was. Ryan and I had been friends since we were 19 years old, 15 years, the kind of friendship that accumulates its own history, its own private language, its own catalog of shared experience so dense that you stop being able to tell where the friendship ends and your own personality begins. He was the best man at my wedding 6 years ago. He gave a speech that made people cry, including me, including Emily, including Ryan himself. I have a photograph from that night. The three of us, arms around each other, laughing at something I can no longer remember. That sat on our bookshelf in the living room until the week after the party, when I took it down and put it face down in a drawer and left it there. I haven't opened that drawer since. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks before the party. A text from Ryan, which in itself was completely ordinary. We texted constantly, the easy low-stakes communication of two people who had been friends long enough that conversation required no preamble. But the text was slightly odd in its construction. He wanted to throw a surprise gathering for Emily. Nothing big, just close friends. A chance to celebrate her recent promotion at work. He'd handle everything. He just needed me to get her there on Saturday the 15th. Tell her we were going to his place for dinner. Nothing more. Keep it simple. I remember reading it twice. Not because anything alarmed me, nothing did, not consciously. But because there was something slightly off in the register of the message that I couldn't locate precisely. Ryan and I planned things together. We didn't send each other instructions. He had framed it as a request, but the structure was more like a directive. I set the phone down and then picked it up again and read it a third time and then told myself I was overanalyzing a text from my best friend, which was the kind of thing that happens when you are tired and stressed from work and looking for complexity in places that don't contain it. I replied, sure. She'll have no idea. Looking back at that reply now, at the easy confidence of those 4 words, there's a particular irony that I have sat with many times since. She had no idea. About the surprise, about Ryan, about the 6 months that preceded that Saturday evening. I was the last to know, which meant I was the only one walking into that house without a map. Emily had been promoted to senior project manager at her consultancy 3 weeks earlier. It was genuine good news. She had worked hard for it, had navigated a difficult internal process with patience and political intelligence, and had come home that evening flushed and genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen from her in a while. We'd had dinner out to celebrate, just the 2 of us, and I had watched her across the table and felt the particular warmth of a person who is glad for someone they love and hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since they had seen that specific happiness on that specific face. I filed that observation away without examining it further. That was a mistake I would understand only later. The Saturday of the party arrived gray and cold. The first genuinely autumn day of the year, leaves coming down in the kind of slow, persistent fall that makes everything look slightly melancholic even when nothing is wrong. Emily got dressed without knowing where we were going. She thought we were having dinner at Ryan's, casual, no occasion. She wore jeans and a dark green sweater and pulled her hair back on the way out the door. She seemed relaxed. She seemed like herself. I drove to Ryan's house through streets I had driven 100 times. Radio on something neither of us was listening to, and I thought about nothing in particular. I thought about a project deadline the following week. I thought about whether we needed gas. The entirely ordinary interior weather of a man driving to his best friend's house on a Saturday evening with his wife in the passenger seat. We pulled into Ryan Street. There were more cars than usual parked along the curb, which I noticed and explained to myself as neighbors, nothing significant. I told Emily we were a little early. She shrugged and checked her phone. We walked up to the front door. I knocked because that's what you do even at the house of someone you've been to so many times you know which floorboards creak. Ryan answered. His expression when he saw us was, I have thought about this expression a great deal, complicated. Not the clean delight of a person whose surprise is about to land. Something layered underneath it, a micro-expression I registered and did not process, filed under Ryan being Ryan and moved past. "Hey," he said. "Come in." We came in. I didn't find out what that expression meant until 40 minutes later, standing in the doorway of the upstairs bedroom, the door swinging open on its quiet hinge, the room doing what rooms do when you walk into them, offering itself up entirely with no capacity for discretion. To understand what the party destroyed, you need to understand what I believed I had. Emily and I had been together 9 years, married for 6 of them. We had met through mutual friends at a gallery opening downtown, the kind of event neither of us particularly wanted to attend, which became the first thing we had in common and the foundation of a conversation that lasted 3 hours standing in front of paintings we weren't really looking at. She was working in marketing consulting then, sharp and decisive and funnier than you expected from someone who presented so professionally. I was 2 years into my urban planning position, still learning which battles were worth fighting in a bureaucracy that moved like cold water. We fit together with the specific ease of 2 people who are surprised to find the fit, which is the best kind. The early years were good in all the ways that matter and some that don't. We bought an apartment, then the house in Meridian Heights 4 years ago. A craftsman on a quiet street with a porch we actually used, a yard that required more attention than I gave it, and neighbors who waved without requiring conversation. We built the kind of domestic life that doesn't announce itself dramatically, just accumulates quietly. The Sunday habit of coffee and the newspaper, the disagreements about temperature and television volume, the way certain silences become comfortable rather than awkward, the private vocabulary that develops between 2 people who spend enough time together. Ryan had been part of our life as a couple almost from the beginning. He and Emily got along with the natural ease of 2 people who share a sense of humor and a tolerance for the same kind of social occasion. He came to dinner often. He was present at the milestones, the apartment, the house, the promotion celebrations, the ordinary Saturdays that don't have names but constitute most of a life. Emily had once described him as the brother you actually like, which had made all 3 of us laugh. I have thought about that sentence many times since October. The first thing I can identify now, looking back with the clarity that only arrives after the fact, was a shift in Emily's energy sometime around early spring. Not dramatic, not even particularly noticeable in any single instance. More like a change in atmospheric pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before you consciously register that the weather is changing. She started spending more time at the office. Her industry had always required irregular hours, so this alone registered only as a mild data point. But there was a quality to the lateness that was slightly different from the lateness of deadline pressure. Less tired when she came home, more energized, a kind of faint residual alertness that didn't match the story of a draining evening finishing a client brief. I noticed the way you notice something when you're not ready to name it, peripherally without direct examination, stored in a category labeled probably nothing and moved past. She started going to a yoga class on Wednesday evenings. Again, not unusual on its own. She had talked about starting something physical for months, had tried a spin class the previous year and quit after 3 sessions, had mentioned yoga specifically as something she wanted to try. The class was at a studio across town, ran from 7 to 8:30. She came home afterward with the particular quiet of someone who has exerted themselves and found the exertion useful. I was glad for her. I told her so. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't know until much later, was that the yoga studio's Wednesday class ran from 6 to 7:15. The extra hour and 15 minutes had a different explanation entirely. Ryan started texting me slightly less frequently in the spring. We had always had the low-hum communication of close friends. Not constant, but consistent, the kind of contact that doesn't require occasion. By April, the texts had thinned in a way I registered as him being busy with work, with Claire, with the normal pressures of a life that was getting more complicated as he moved further into his 30s. He was still present, we still got together, still talked, but something in the texture of the contact had changed. A slight, careful quality that I interpreted, at the time, as him being distracted. I understand now that he was being careful. There is a difference. There was an evening in May. A Sunday, I think, because we were both home and the pace was slow the way Sundays are, when Emily was in the kitchen and her phone buzzed on the coffee table where she had left it. I was on the couch reading, close enough to see the screen light up. I wasn't reading her messages. I glanced at it the way anyone glances at a phone that lights up nearby, a reflex without intention. The preview showed a name and the first few words of a message. The name was Ryan. The first words were, "Tonight was," and then the screen dimmed. I held what I had seen for a moment the way you hold something fragile, carefully, with both hands, not quite sure what it is yet. Tonight was Ryan and Emily communicating on a Sunday evening. That alone was not strange. They texted occasionally, the ordinary contact of two people in the same extended social circle. But tonight implied a recent shared experience, and I could not locate a recent shared experience that explained it because I had been with Emily, as far as I knew, for most of the weekend. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't ask Emily about it when she came back from the kitchen. I put the thought in the same category as the other things I was not yet ready to examine, and I went back to my book. That was a specific kind of cowardice, and I have been honest with myself about that. Not the cowardice of fear exactly, more the cowardice of comfort. The life I was living was good enough that the cost of investigating a possible disruption felt higher than the cost of not investigating. I chose the life I had over the truth I might find, and I made that choice without fully admitting I was making it. The price of that choice arrived in October. Summer moved through the way summer does when you are inside a life that appears normal, quickly, with warmth, with enough forward momentum that there is always something else to focus on. Emily's promotion process began formally in June and consumed a significant portion of her professional energy through July and into August. She was genuinely invested in it. I could see that, and the investment explained the late evenings, the distracted weekends, the moments when she was physically present but clearly running through something in her head. I supported her through it without reservation, the way you support someone you love when they are working towards something real. I brought home dinner on nights she was too tired to cook. I gave her space on weekends when she needed to work. I believed, being a good husband. Looking back, I was also being very convenient. Ryan got engaged to Claire in August. It was not a surprise. They had been together 3 years, and marriage had been the visible trajectory for at least 2 of them. He called me the evening he proposed, before the social media announcement, before the calls to family, which was the kind of thing he would do and which moved me in the way those gestures from old friends always move you. We talked for an hour. He sounded happy. He sounded, if I am being precise about it, slightly pressured underneath the happiness, but I attributed that to the weight of the occasion, the particular vertigo of a major life decision just made. Claire was warm, organized, and genuinely fond of both Emily and me. She had folded into our social group with the natural ease of someone who didn't need to work at it. I liked her. I thought she and Ryan were well matched. I think about Claire now with a specific kind of sorrow that I couldn't have anticipated. September is when the atmospheric pressure change became something I could no longer comfortably ignore. Emily came home one evening from what she said was dinner with a colleague, a woman from her office named Jessica, apparently celebrating a job transition. She was in good spirits, lighter than she had been in weeks, with that particular quality of a person who has been somewhere they wanted to be. She kissed me hello and asked how my evening had been and went upstairs to change. And I sat in the kitchen with my laptop and the specific unease of a man who has just noticed something he can't immediately explain. I knew Jessica. Not well. I had met her twice at Emily's work events, but well enough to have her last name. On an impulse I would not have been able to fully justify if asked. I opened a browser tab and found Jessica's LinkedIn page. Her most recent post, dated that afternoon, was a photograph of herself at an airport departure gate. She was going to a conference in Seattle. She had been posting from the airport since noon. She had not been at dinner with Emily that evening. I closed the laptop and sat very still for a moment. The house was quiet around me. The refrigerator's low hum, a car passing outside, Emily moving around upstairs, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening that was no longer ordinary. I didn't go upstairs and ask Emily where she had actually been. I have examined that decision more than almost any other from this period. Part of it was the same comfort-preserving instinct I'd exercised in May. But part of it was something newer and colder, the beginning of a different kind of calculation. If I asked and she lied, I would know she had lied and still know nothing else. If I waited and watched, I might eventually know something real. I went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to Emily come in beside me and thought, something is wrong. not as a fear, as a fact. The following week, I started paying attention with a different quality of attention. Not obsessively. I went to work, I managed my projects, I cooked dinner and had conversations and inhabited my life with apparent normalcy. But underneath all of it, a part of me was watching, cataloging, maintaining a running inventory of small details that individually meant nothing and collectively were building toward something I was not yet ready to name. I noticed that Emily had started silencing her phone before she came to bed. She had never done this before. She used it as an alarm and always left the volume on. Now, before getting into bed, she would tap through a brief sequence of screens that included, I could see from my side of the bed, the volume controls. I noticed that she had created a new email account. I didn't know what the account was or what it was used for. I saw it appear as a logged-in account on the tablet we shared when she forgot to switch back to her regular one, and then it disappeared the next time I looked. The address was a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. I wrote it down on a piece of paper and put the paper in my desk drawer. I noticed that she mentioned Ryan less than she used to. This was, paradoxically, the detail that landed with the most weight. Ryan had been a natural, unremarkable part of our conversational landscape for 9 years. His name appeared in ordinary context constantly, the way the names of people central to your life appear without effort. The reduction was subtle. Not an absence, just a thinning. And it hit me with a cold, delayed clarity one evening when I realized I hadn't heard her mention him in 2 weeks. People edit the names of the people they are protecting from scrutiny. That is a thing I now know. The week before the party, I had a conversation with Ryan that I have returned to many times since. We met for lunch, just the two of us, which we did regularly, at a sandwich place near my office. He was his usual self in most ways. Easy, funny, interested in what I was working on. But at one point, somewhere in the middle of the meal, he asked me a question that was slightly off its axis. He asked, with a careful casualness that I now understand was constructed, whether Emily and I had been talking much lately. Whether we were doing okay. I said we were fine. I said it simply, without elaboration. He nodded and took a bite of his sandwich and moved the conversation to something else. But the question stayed with me after lunch, sitting at a slight angle to everything around it, not quite flush with the wall. I told myself he was asking as a friend, that he'd noticed something and was checking in the way old friends do. I told myself this on the drive back to the office. I told myself this for the next 7 days, right up until the moment I knocked on his front door on the 15th of October and he opened it and his face showed me something it hadn't meant to show. The party was not large. 12 people, maybe 15, the specific size of a gathering that feels intimate without being private, large enough for people to move between conversations but small enough that you could track most of the room without effort. I recognized almost everyone. Colleagues of Emily's, a couple we'd been friends with for years, Ryan's neighbors who I'd met at various occasions over the past decade. Emily's genuine surprise when people shouted was real. I watched her face and it was unambiguous, the wide-eyed startled pleasure of someone who had not seen it coming. She laughed and covered her mouth and looked around the room, and when her eyes found me her expression was warm and open and I felt, for a moment, the clean, uncomplicated pleasure of having been part of something that made her happy. That feeling lasted about 20 minutes. The first thing I noticed was Claire. Ryan's fiancée was there, which was expected. But she was quieter than usual, present but contained, occupying the edges of the room rather than the center in the way she normally did. She greeted me with a hug that held a fraction of a second too long, and when she pulled back her smile had something concentrated behind it, a focused quality that didn't match a celebration. I asked if she was okay. She said she was tired, long week. She turned to say something to someone near her and was absorbed into a different conversation. Something about that hug stayed with me. Emily was moving through the room easily, receiving congratulations, refilling her glass, the relaxed social confidence of someone in their element. Ryan was hosting, which meant he was in motion. Drinks, music, the perpetual small management of a gathering, and our paths crossed briefly twice in the first hour without the moment to actually talk. Both times he was warm, present, exactly himself, and both times I had a faint, inexplicable sense of watching a performance I didn't have the program for. Around the 40-minute mark, I went looking for the bathroom. The downstairs bathroom was occupied. Someone had been in there for a while, the door solidly closed. I knew the house well enough to know there was another one upstairs, at the end of the hall past the guest room. I went up. The hallway was dim, the party sounds muffled from below. The bathroom door at the end was open, light off. I walked toward it past the guest room, and the guest room door was mostly closed. Pushed to but not latched, the kind of door that has drifted shut without intention. There was a light on inside, the thin line of it visible along the door's edge. I didn't intend to open it. My hand moved to the door the way your hand moves to something reflexively, before the conscious mind has weighed in. I pushed it open 6 inches, maybe 8, enough for the room to be visible. What I saw in those 3 seconds rearranged everything that had preceded them. Emily, Ryan. I won't describe it further than that. There's no purpose in the specifics. What I will tell you is that neither of them saw me immediately. There was a moment of perhaps 2 seconds where I stood in the doorway seeing something they didn't know was being seen, and in those 2 seconds something in me went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't calm. The kind that happens when a system receives information it cannot immediately process and simply suspends. Emily saw me first. Her expression went through the same rapid sequence I would later see on Ryan's face. Shock, calculation, a brief, terrible attempt at composure. She said my name. Just my name, once, with a specific inflection that contained the full weight of what had just happened. I pulled the door closed. I walked back down the hallway and down the stairs and through the party, which continued around me with complete indifference. I got a drink from the kitchen. I stood by the window for a few minutes. Someone spoke to me, one of Emily's colleagues, talking about the promotion, asking a question, and I answered. I don't remember what I said. I was inside a very specific kind of functional shock that keeps the surface operating while the interior processes something entirely separately. After perhaps 10 minutes, Emily came downstairs. She moved through the room toward me with a controlled composure that was, under the circumstances, impressive. She stood beside me at the window and didn't touch me and said, very quietly, "Can we talk?" "Not here," I said. "I know. But not here." She stood beside me for a moment longer and then moved away, and I watched the party continue, and I thought about 15 years of friendship and 6 years of marriage and the photograph on the bookshelf at home, and I felt, underneath the shock, a deep and specific grief that had nothing theatrical in it. Ryan came downstairs 8 minutes later. He came directly toward me, which took a particular kind of nerve, and when he reached me he didn't start with a denial or an explanation. He started with, "Nate." Just my name, the way Emily had said it. The same weight in it. I looked at him. We had been friends for 15 years. I had known this face in every configuration. Laughing, serious, drunk, grieving, joyful, embarrassed. I had never seen it look the way it looked at me at that moment, which was like the face of a man who has just broken something irreplaceable and is standing in the wreckage understanding, only now, what it actually was. "How long?" I said. He looked at the floor and then back at me. 6 months. 6 months. The yoga class. The late office evenings. The text preview on the Sunday coffee table. Tonight was the lunch question about whether Emily and I were doing okay. 6 months of a map I hadn't been given, of a territory that had been expanding parallel to the life I was living, maintained by 2 people I had trusted completely and simultaneously. I set my drink down on the windowsill. "I'm going to go home now," I said. "Don't call me tonight." I found Emily's coat. I found my keys. I said goodbye to no one because there was no language available to me for what a normal goodbye would require. I drove home through streets that looked exactly as they had 2 hours earlier, which felt, under the circumstances, like a specific kind of insult from the universe. In the house, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Not crying, not yet. Just sitting in the particular silence of a person who has just had their entire recent past quietly rewritten underneath them, like a document being revised in another window while you were reading it. I opened my laptop. I went to the shared photo cloud that Emily and I had set up years ago, where we both synced our phone libraries. A habit from the early years of the relationship, a small domestic convenience that neither of us had thought to discontinue or think much about. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Something concrete, I think. Something that would convert what I had seen from a single terrible image into a documented pattern. Something that would take the emotional devastation and give it an evidentiary shape. because evidence was the only thing I knew how to process at that moment. I found it in approximately 4 minutes. A shared folder Emily had created, not visible from the main library, accessible only if you knew to look in the secondary album organization. She had been careful but not careful enough, or perhaps she had never anticipated I would look in precisely this way. The folder contained photographs and videos going back 5 months, organized by date with an unconscious neatness that told me something about the double life she had been maintaining. It had its own internal order, its own system of record. I looked at enough to know what I was looking at. Then I closed the laptop and went upstairs. I lay on top of the bed in my clothes and looked at the ceiling and thought, for a long time, about Ryan's toast at our wedding 6 years ago, about the specific things he had said, about marriage, about loyalty, about what it meant to know someone and choose to stand beside them. He had said those words sincerely. I had believed him then. I still believed, in some terrible way, that he had meant them. That was perhaps the most disorienting part of all of it. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that the person who had committed it was someone who had also meant the things he said. Both were real. The friendship and the betrayal were not opposites. They were layers of the same person, existing simultaneously, and I had only ever seen one of them. Emily came home at midnight. I heard her car, heard the front door, heard her come upstairs with a careful quietness that told me she knew I was awake. She stopped in the doorway of the bedroom. She didn't come in. "Nate," she said. "I know about the cloud folder," I said. A long silence. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was very small. "I'm going to sleep," I said. "We'll talk tomorrow." She went to the guest room. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me and understood, with a clarity that had no heat in it at all, that the life I had been living was finished. The conversation happened on Sunday morning, at the kitchen table, with coffee neither of us was drinking. Emily had come downstairs at 8. I was already there. She sat across from me with the particular posture of someone prepared to receive whatever is coming. Composed, present, no longer attempting to manage the situation. Something in her had released overnight, some load-bearing wall of performance had come down, and what remained was quieter and rawer and, in its own painful way, more recognizable to me than the person I had been living with for the past 6 months. I had spent the night constructing a version of this conversation that was controlled and analytical, a version in which I presented what I knew in an organized sequence and asked the questions I needed answered without emotional escalation. I had built that version carefully as a kind of structural protection. And then, when Emily sat down and looked at me across the table, most of it dissolved, because you cannot sit across from someone you have loved for 9 years and speak to them in the language of a deposition. "Tell me how it started," I said. She told me. It had begun in April, a work event that Ryan had also attended, one of those overlap occasions that happen when you are all part of the same extended social world. They had ended up in a conversation alone at the end of the evening, and something in that conversation had shifted. She said she couldn't explain exactly what had shifted or why. I believed her on this, not because it absolved her, but because I think she genuinely didn't fully understand it herself. She said she had tried to let it be nothing, that she had told herself it was nothing, that it had become something anyway. I listened to this without interrupting. The skill of listening without interrupting is one I had developed over years of professional meetings where the ability to hold space for information you found frustrating was simply a requirement. Now I used it differently. "Did you love him?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think so. I think I was confused about what I was feeling. And I was careless with the confusion." She paused. "That's not an excuse. I know that. Did he know what he was doing to our marriage?" She met my eyes. "Yes." That single syllable landed with a weight that the whole preceding conversation hadn't quite reached. Yes, Ryan knew. He had known what he was doing to 15 years of friendship, to a marriage he had publicly celebrated, to a woman his fiancée considered a friend. He had known and continued. That was a choice made repeatedly, over 6 months, by a man who had stood at my wedding and talked about loyalty with evident sincerity. I thought, sitting at that table, about something that had been forming quietly in me overnight, a realization that didn't feel like anger or grief but something more fundamental, like a structural understanding. Trust had always been, for me, something you extended toward people who had earned it and then maintained essentially without review. Once given, it ran indefinitely unless specifically revoked. I understood now that this was not wisdom. It was an abdication, a way of outsourcing the maintenance of something critical to other people, on the assumption that they would value it the way I did. Ryan had not valued it the way I did. Emily had not valued it the way I did. And the trust one had extended so completely and so without reservation had become the environment in which both of them had operated. My certainty had been their cover. I didn't say any of this to Emily. It wasn't relevant to what was being said between us. It was mine. I'm going to file for divorce, I said. I've already made that decision. I'm not telling you to open a negotiation. I'm telling you so you can find a lawyer. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she said, I know that's what you're going to do. She looked at the table. I'm sorry, Nate. I know there's nothing. She stopped. Tried again. I know there's nothing I can say that changes it. I just need you to know that what we had was real to me. What I did doesn't mean it wasn't real. I thought about that. I thought about the Sunday evening porch in May, the yellow-orange light, the ease of sitting beside her. I thought about 9 years of accumulated ordinary life. I know, I said. That's actually one of the harder parts. She looked at me with an expression I had no category for. We sat at the table for a while longer, in a silence that was not hostile, just exhausted and sad and final. The coffee had gone completely cold. Ryan called at noon. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 2. At 3 he sent a text. I need you to know that what happened wasn't. I don't have words for it, Nate. I don't have anything that's good enough. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I'm sorry. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the desk. I thought about calling Claire. I had been thinking about it since the night before, when her hug at the party, that slightly too long, slightly too weighted embrace, had told me something I hadn't been ready to register in the moment. She knew, or she suspected, or she was in the same position I had been in for months, carrying an unease she hadn't yet allowed herself to examine. I called her at 4 o'clock. She answered on the second ring. Nate, she said, and the way she said it told me everything about what she already knew and how long she had known it. Claire, I said, I need to talk to you about Ryan. There was a pause. Then, I know. I've been waiting for this call. We talked for an hour. Claire had found out 6 weeks before the party, a message she had seen accidentally, the same kind of peripheral vision discovery that had marked my own slow accumulation of evidence. She had confronted Ryan privately. He had apparently told her it was over. He had told her that a week before the party. He had been telling her things for 6 weeks while continuing the affair and throwing a party to celebrate my wife's promotion in his own house. That detail, the party, thrown knowingly, orchestrated as a cover or a farewell or perhaps simply a terrible decision made by someone who had lost any clear sense of what they were doing, was the one I kept returning to. There was something about the audacity of it that defied simple explanation. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the behavior of someone so deep inside a situation of their own construction that they had lost the external perspective required to understand what they were actually doing. Claire filed her own paperwork the following week. She called me to tell me, not because I was her person to call, but because we had become, unexpectedly, the two people in the world who understood the specific shape of what had happened to us. The afternoon after my conversation with Emily, I went for a long walk. No destination, just movement, the specific comfort of a body in motion when the mind has nowhere to go. I ended up in a coffee shop I didn't usually frequent, on the far side of the neighborhood, and I sat at a corner table with an Americano and looked at nothing in particular. An older man at the adjacent table, 60, perhaps 65, reading a physical newspaper, the kind of person you don't often see anymore, looked up at some point and caught my eye with the direct simplicity of an older generation and said, "Rough day." I almost laughed. "Rough week," I said. He nodded as though this were sufficient. Then, without preamble or apparent connection, "The thing about betrayal," he said, "is that it tells you something true about the person who did it, and something true about yourself, and the second truth is usually the one worth paying attention to." I looked at him. "Just in my experience," he said, and went back to his newspaper. I sat with that for the rest of the coffee. I sat with it on the walk home. I have sat with it many times since. The legal process moved at the pace legal processes move, not slowly exactly, but with an institutional deliberateness that kept the practical reality of the divorce at a certain managed distance from the emotional one. I retained a lawyer at the recommendation of a colleague the Monday after the party. She was thorough and clear-eyed, and the first meeting, in which she walked me through the procedural landscape of what was about to happen, had the strange effect of making something catastrophic feel organized. Emily retained her own representation. The process was not combative. We had no children, no particularly entangled financial interests, nothing that required extended negotiation. We had bought the house together, and the question of what to do with it was ultimately resolved by selling it, which I had proposed and Emily had accepted without resistance. We had built it into a home with some care, and neither of us, I think, wanted to be the one who stayed in it. I moved into a rented apartment on the east side of the city in November, a one-bedroom on the third floor of a converted building with high ceilings and enough light to make it feel larger than it was. I furnished it slowly and without particular system, acquiring things as they became necessary rather than all at once. By December it felt like mine, not in the curated, considered way the house had felt like ours, but in a simpler and in some ways more honest way. Every object in it was something I had chosen alone, for reasons that were entirely my own. I did not hear from Ryan for 3 weeks after the party. Then a letter arrived, handwritten, for pages, the longest uninterrupted thing he had ever communicated to me. I read it at the kitchen table of the new apartment on a Tuesday evening. It was, by any reasonable measure, a genuine accounting of what he had done and why, of the specific failures of character that had allowed it to continue, of what he understood about the damage he had caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said explicitly that he wasn't asking for it, which was the correct thing to say. He said he hoped someday I could believe that what the friendship had been was real, separately from what he had done to it. I held the letter for a long time. Then I put it in a desk drawer, a different one from the photograph, which was still face down in its drawer in the old house. I haven't replied. I don't know if I will. Some things require more time than I currently have available. Claire and I spoke several more times through the fall and winter. Not frequently, we were not and are not close friends in the conventional sense. But there was a specific understanding between us, the kind that develops between people who have sustained the same category of damage from the same source, and that understanding made the conversations easy in a way that required no explanation. She moved to her sister's city in January, a fresh geography that I understood without needing it explained. She seemed, when we last spoke, to be doing the work of rebuilding in a serious and considered way. I hope she is well. I believe she is. The divorce was finalized in March. My lawyer called me on a Thursday morning to tell me, and I was in the middle of reviewing site plans for a new park development, and I said thank you and ended the call and looked at the site plans for a moment and then looked out the window at the gray March sky and felt something shift in my chest that was not happiness and not grief but something that combined elements of both. The specific bittersweet settling of a chapter that has finally, completely, closed. I went back to the site plans. The urban planning work had been, through all of this, a kind of anchor. There is something grounding about work that concerns itself with physical space, with how people move through an environment, what they need from it, how the design of a place shapes the experience of being in it. I had always found it satisfying in a quiet, cumulative way. In the months after October, I found it something closer to essential. The work asked specific questions and rewarded careful answers, and that structure was, for a while, exactly what I needed. I thought often that winter about the older man in the coffee shop, about the thing he had said. That betrayal tells you something true about the person who committed it, and something true about yourself, and the second truth is usually the one worth paying attention to. What it told me about myself was not comfortable to examine. I had built my understanding of my own life on the foundation of other people's trustworthiness, which is not wisdom but dependency. I had allowed the certainty I felt about Emily, about Ryan, to substitute for attention. I had confused the absence of visible conflict with the presence of genuine health. I had been, for years, very good at the surface of things, at the shared Sunday mornings and the dinner parties and the easy companionable shorthand, and not particularly rigorous about what was underneath. That is not self-blame. I want to be careful about that distinction. What Emily and Ryan did was their choice, made freely and maintained deliberately, and no failure on my part created an obligation or a justification for it. But the second truth, what it told me about myself, was that I had been living inside a comfort zone that required no examination and therefore provided no immunity. I had not been building a marriage, exactly. I had been maintaining the appearance of one, and the appearance had been good enough that I had confused it for the thing itself. That realization was not pleasant. It was, however, useful. There is a coffee shop I go to most mornings now, a neighborhood place 3 blocks from the apartment. I have been going there long enough that the staff know my order, which is a small comfort I have learned to value rather than overlook. I sit at the same corner table most days when it is available, and I read, or work, or simply drink coffee and watch the street through the window. I have not run into the older man again. I don't expect to. Some conversations arrive exactly when they are needed and then don't require a sequel. The park project I was reviewing on the morning my divorce was finalized has since moved into the construction phase. I drive past the site occasionally on the way to other things. There is something specific about watching a designed space come into physical existence. The gap between the plans I reviewed in an office and the actual ground being broken, the actual structure being built. It never gets ordinary. The distance between what a thing is on paper and what it becomes in the world remains, for me, one of the more interesting aspects of the work. I have been thinking about that distance in other contexts lately. My friend Marcus, someone I had known separately from Ryan, outside that particular circle, took me to a baseball game in April. We sat in the upper deck with beers and watched 9 innings with the specific uncomplicated pleasure of a late spring afternoon that requires nothing from you. Driving back afterward, he asked, without preamble, whether I was doing better. I said I was. He said good, and that was the entire extent of the conversation about it, which was exactly the right amount. The photograph is still in the drawer. I have not looked at it since I put it there. I don't know when I will or whether I will or what it will mean when I do. There is a version of the future in which I take it out and look at it and feel only the archaeological distance of something historical, a document of a time that was what it was, no more and no less. I am working toward that version. The apartment is good. The work is good. The mornings are quiet in a way I have learned to receive rather than resist. The other day I walked past the old house on Meridian Heights. Not deliberately, just incidentally, the route taking me through the neighborhood. It has new owners. There were children's bikes on the porch. A wind chime I didn't recognize hung near the front door, turning slowly in the October air. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment. Then I kept walking. This story is, at its core, about the specific vulnerability that comes from trusting 2 people at once, and what happens when that trust, extended to both simultaneously, becomes the invisible scaffolding for both of their deceptions. Nate's situation differs from most infidelity narratives in one structurally significant way. The affair partner was not a stranger. He was someone Nate had invested 15 years of genuine intimacy in. This means that when the betrayal was confirmed, it didn't simply revise Nate's understanding of his marriage. It revised his understanding of his own judgment, his own history, his own capacity to read the people closest to him. Emily's affair was painful. Ryan's involvement made that pain categorical. What the story ultimately reveals about the mechanics of long-term deception is something that extends beyond this specific situation. Emily and Ryan were able to operate for 6 months inside a shared social architecture. The dinner parties, the text threads, the house Nate had been to 100 times. Precisely because Nate's trust was not conditional or monitored. He had given it fully and left it running, the way you leave a system running when you have confidence in its maintenance. That confidence was not naive. It was earned over years by 2 people who had been genuinely trustworthy and then, at a specific inflection point, stopped being so. The trust predated the betrayal and outlasted the evidence that should have disrupted it. And this is the specific failure mode of intimate trust. It is calibrated to history rather than present reality. The invitation to the party is the detail that most rewards examination. Ryan organized it. He invited Nate. He managed the logistics, chose the occasion, set the scene. The decision to do this, to throw a celebration for the woman he was sleeping with, to orchestrate the attendance of the husband he was deceiving, to host it in the house where that deception had presumably occurred. suggests not malice but a complete disintegration of perspective. By October, Ryan had been inside the situation long enough that he had lost the external vantage point required to understand what the situation looked like from outside. He had been making small accommodations to his conscience for 6 months, each one slightly larger than the last, until the cumulative distance from ordinary ethical functioning was so great that throwing a party seemed like a reasonable thing to do. This is what sustained deception does to the person practicing it. It normalizes the abnormal incrementally, until the person who would have found their own behavior unthinkable in March finds it manageable in October. Claire's position in the story introduces a dimension that complicates the simple betrayer/betrayed structure. She had known for 6 weeks before the party, had confronted Ryan, had received what was apparently a commitment that it was over, had chosen to remain with him on that basis. That choice, made under conditions of incomplete and unreliable information, made her simultaneously a betrayed person and a person who had made a decision that cost Nate something. Not through malice, but through the understandable and very human desire to believe the version of reality that preserved what she had. She could not have known that the conversation she had with Ryan did not, in fact, end the affair. She was working with the information she had. But the information she had been provided by someone with no incentive to be accurate. What this reveals about how deception propagates is worth sitting with. Lies told to one person often require the continued credulity of others to be sustained, and those others, positioned as innocent, become inadvertent participants in a structure they did not construct and did not choose. Nate's decision to call Claire rather than simply sending evidence anonymously was the right one, even if it wasn't comfortable. It treated her as a person rather than a means, gave her the opportunity to ask her own questions rather than receive a verdict. That impulse toward treating people with the dignity of information, even painful information, is one of the things the story asks the audience to notice. What I keep coming back to, thinking about this story, is the wedding toast. Ryan meant it. I'm genuinely convinced of that. He stood up in front of everyone who mattered to both of them and said true things about friendship and love and loyalty, and he felt them in the moment he said them. And then, for years later, he did what he did. That coexistence, genuine feeling and genuine betrayal inhabiting the same person, is the part that doesn't resolve neatly. We want the people who hurt us to have always been secretly capable of it so we can revise the history cleanly. But it's rarely that simple. Sometimes the person who hurt you was also, genuinely, the person you thought they were. And the question isn't which version was real, both were. The question is what you do now with the full complicated truth of it. Nate kept walking. That was enough.